Hi, everybody. This is going to be one of three videos that I'm going to provide to you that's going to take the place of some of the classes we missed. And these are all going to cover the same basic topic, but I'm going to take it into three sections. I had originally said two, but I realized it made more sense to do it in three. So I would like you to watch all of these videos. Underneath each video, you're going to see some links that I'm going to refer to that are going to help you kind of work this out in your head, give you some references, and that should help you make sense of this. But this is stuff you're going to see in game design all the time. So I'm very confident these things are going to come back and you're going to see them over and over again. Now, the central topic that all of these videos are about is a question of how uncertainty works in games. So what I want you to think about for a second is this basic formula we've been talking about for games, which is that a goal plus rules equals fun. And there's something embedded in that we talked about in the definition of games, which is the idea that games have players, right? And what differentiates games and, in general interactive work, but games for our purposes from other kinds of entertainment media and other kinds of storytelling media and other kinds of, just sort of like artistic media is the fact that people interact with it, right? And that when you combine it with the formula of goals plus rules equals fun has a ramification that's really important. Insofar as I'm pursuing a goal and I have the ability to interact, what this means is that my interaction has to be meaningful. Now, we've talked about this before because we talked about this in terms of what we called meaningful choice, right? Like choice that has something to do with the goal. But if you think about that kind of hard, what you start to realize is that it's really important to a game that the goal be something that my interactivity affects, right? So that the choices that I make during the game, whether they be cerebral choices of like strategic decisions or tactical decisions or exhibitions of skill or exhibitions of luck, whatever those things are, we're always have to have a relationship. There just needs to be this fundamental causal system where the choices I make have an impact on my ability to get to the goal. But if you analyze that, what you realize is that means that I can't actually know before I start playing the game if I'm going to achieve the goal. Because if I knew I was going to achieve the goal, then my choices moment to moment wouldn't really matter, right? Like if I know I'm going to win, then I'm not actually making choices anymore. Like there's a way to win and I just do it, right? And if I know I'm going to lose, the same thing happens. Like my choices aren't relevant. I'm just going to lose. And so by the very nature of the choice being meaningful, right? Like that it has an effect on a goal, that by its nature tells us that I can't actually know in advance if I'm going to succeed at the goal, which means that the game has to have some components of it that are not known to me at the start. And you could sum all of this up by talking about uncertainty, right? That I have to have a level of uncertainty in a game for a game to function. That uncertainty can take a lot of forms, right? In a multiplayer game, the uncertainty really boils down to like winning or losing, right? Like it's just, am I going to win or not, right? And then if you think about sports, that's like a really easy example. Like we all come into the field with the same rules and the same essential setup, and then we just sort of see whose decisions are better and whose skill is better, and we just collide, right? And that gives you a sense, like quite clearly, that like if you knew who was going to win a sports game, you wouldn't watch. And this is actually, you can see this like really clearly in entertainment culture, because like sports are one of the very few things in entertainment culture that streaming has not really destroyed as a live piece of entertainment, because seeing a game you know the outcome of is not actually interesting. Like if I want to watch a basketball game, I'm interested in the basketball game because I don't know who's going to win. If I know who's going to win, then watching it is a very different thing that most people are not interested in. So I need that kind of space. But then there's a kind of second order relationship of this. If you think about like sort of single player storytelling games, right? Like in a single player storytelling game, I know that the eventual outcome of the game is that I will win, because if I just keep doing it long enough, I know that it's a set path from the beginning to the end. You think about something like Last of Us, right? Like everyone ends up in the same place in Last of Us. It's essentially the same outcome in the most gross sense, right? In the sense of like we get to the end of the game. But how I get through every single scenario is not clear, and I can lose in every single, skill-based scenario, right? Like every time I walk into a space where there are infected people, like I could die, and then I won't get past it until I succeed at it. So how I succeed at it is kind of important. And of course, there are also like more subtle variables in that system of like how much ammunition do I have, how much damage have I taken, like what other equipment have I gathered. All of those things start to factor into like, oh, how did I do in this battle? And games that even have a lot of grind in them, like JRPGs, a lot of time the interesting decision making in JRPGs is about these secondary attributes, like did I waste health potions on this, or how much mana did I have when I exited this, or like where did I put my stats for future battles? Like all of those things start to have an effect. So essentially what all of this means is that it's really, really important to a game that when I start a game, I cannot see the outcome of it, and my decisions will have to weigh very heavily on whether I succeed or not in the game. And that means that the game has to build very particular, very specific kinds of uncertainty into it for the game to function. So how do you put uncertainty into games? The good news is there are, in the most conceptual sense, only 3 ways to do it. And we're going to talk about each of those ways, one per video. And each one of them does this function of like create conditions where people can't easily see the outcome of a game, and where there's something in the game that becomes unknowable to them. Just a couple points about this before we go on. I'm going to give these in like sort of like their conceptual spaces, and I'm going to give you examples of them. There are obviously lots of examples of all these kinds of things. So just something you want to keep in mind is that I can't cover every single thing in game design, and game design is complex. So I'm giving you the topics, and the topics should help you because you can kind of think of them as like things you could inject into your game. But the specific mechanics that do this are going to be up to you. Like, and there's lots of different forms, and the more you play games, the more you'll see forms of them. The second thing is often these things are combined. We don't just use one of them. Like they're pieces that we throw into games. So mini games will have 2 or all 3 of these ideas in them somewhere. But you don't have to have all of them. And this is one of the things that's actually really interesting, that a lot of people think randomness is a really critical part of games. And actually many games have no randomness in them at all. But a game will always have one of these 3 things, and often will have more than one. And you should, as a designer, just sort of think about them as things you can add, right? Like you might add these things because the game gets too deterministic, right? Like meaning every time someone plays, they always play the same way. You might add one of these things because the game starts to feel like too rigid, right? Like a game can actually feel like it's very expert, or it could be such that the best player always just wins. And depending on who your audience is, you might want to make a game where you don't want the best player to always win. You want to give people who are less skilled a chance, right? And all of those things start to function in this space as like tools that you can work with, right? So what I want to do is just go through each of those in order. Now, the 3 of them, just so you heard them all, and then I'm going to tackle the first one, and I'll define the other ones as I go on, are complexity, randomness, and hidden information. So any game will have some combination of complexity, randomness, and hidden information. Now, these 3 things are different. They serve a similar function in that they introduce uncertainty into a system, but they do it in different ways, and they have different ramifications for how people play. So I'm going to take them each in turn. The first one I'm going to talk about is complexity. Now, complexity is interesting as something that creates uncertainty because essentially what it does is it just creates something that's so difficult to absorb or so difficult to achieve that even though it can be kind of transparent what's going on, you essentially can't solve it, right? Like at the start of something, I simply can't solve it. So a good example of complexity is physical games, right? Like often physical games have a lot of complexity. Like a 3-point shot in basketball, I think is a good example of complexity. A 3-point shot is a 3-point shot because it is a more difficult shot to make, right? And so the challenge of a 3-point shot isn't really tactical, although there obviously is some tactics about like how you're avoiding blockers and how you can get a clear shot. But it's just not simple to sink a 3-point basket. It takes a certain amount of skill. If you think about a game like darts, right? Like the scoring in darts is just where you hit the thing on the dartboard. So why is there like very transparent scoring on a dartboard? There's like a highest scoring spot on a dartboard, right? It's the 20, it's the lower band of the 20. Right? It's because it's very small, and hitting that consistently is just hard, right? So complexity can take the form of just something that's difficult to do. And if it's difficult to do, then you're not going to succeed at it every time. And, and I've said this before about meaningful choice, but I think it's worth it to go back to now, right? Like these physical skills essentially aren't that really different than strategic skills, like cerebral strategic skills. It's just that there's so many variables in physical stuff that it's just like very hard to calculate. And we do a lot of that stuff unconsciously. Like our muscles actually know the things before our brains know them. If you get really good at tennis, you are swinging the tennis racket before like it fires all the way up to your brain to kind of tell you in some like executive function way to respond, right? Like you just start getting really good at just like what's called muscle memory, which is literally what it is, right? Like you just change what you're doing in the moment for something like that. But like if I swing my tennis racket, there's so many variables going into how I swing my tennis racket that I just don't know if I'm going to succeed or not, unless I'm quite skilled. And even when I am skilled, unpredictable things will happen, right? And then once you start dealing with multiple people on a field, then like all of that complexity just grows and grows and grows. When you look at this, though, I think it's actually more useful for us, though, for the purpose of analyzing this, to look at board games, because board games, there's a class of board games that like really dwells in this complexity. And to understand this, that we're going to start talking about a type of math that's inherent to games. And these are the lessons, by the way, where we're going to really talk about math. I'm not going to do a ton of math in these videos because I don't typically want to do all the math in the lessons. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce the math to you as you're working on stuff. And I will often there's a couple of rules I will point out that are like helpful to do this, but the math that we're talking about here is one of the central maths to game design. It's probably the most central math to game design. And that math is called combinatorics. So combinatorics, you can kind of hear it in the word. It's like combine, right? Like combinatorics is the base math for a bunch of other things you do with math, like statistics and probability. Combinatorics is the math of figuring out how many things are in a set. Meaning, like if I have a set of possible things that can happen and I want to count them, right, given some initial conditions, how do I figure out how many of them there are? And that's really useful because like when I am trying to figure out things like percentage chances of success or averages, right? Like knowing the full number is a really big thing. And it actually turns out to be kind of complicated to do that kind of math. Like once you start adding lots of factors to things, this gets a little bit complicated. But in the simplest way of thinking about it, combinatorics is the math that just tells us what a possibility space is. Like I can actually just look at something and mathematically calculate how big it is. Now, that's not like super useful all the time in terms of like knowing the actual number, but it's a useful way of thinking about games. And so to illustrate this, I want to talk about a couple of games quickly that you are familiar with, that you have played probably, and then one game you haven't played probably, but I'm going to give you an exercise to play it in class when we meet again so that you have a chance to sort of see what it feels like. The first game I want to talk about is tic-tac-toe. And I'm sure you've played tic-tac-toe before, right? You make a grid with 2 lines so that you have 3 squares. It's a 2-player game. Someone plays X, someone plays O, and you're trying to get 3 in a row by taking turns putting X's and O's on the board. Now, my guess is if we were in class, I would poll you, but the results are pretty much always the same. That like when you ask people, have you played tic-tac-toe? Just about everybody says yes. But when you ask students, in your age demographic, right, meaning like very late teens through early 30s, have you played tic-tac-toe with anyone who is not a child recently? The answer is no. And you typically just stop playing tic-tac-toe, right? Like you just play it for a while and then you stop. You play it when you're a child and then you sort of leave it behind. And so why do we leave it behind? And the answer is that like probably if you played enough tic-tac-toe, you can work it to a stalemate immediately. Right? Like you kind of can watch the first move and then just know where to go so that you can never end up creating a condition where the other player wins, but then you don't win either. In game design terms, we would call that solved, right? Tic-tac-toe is solved. There is a certain way you can play that no matter what X does, you can block X and then the game ends in a stalemate. So why is tic-tac-toe solvable? Well, if you think about it, you can actually just calculate how many types of moves there are in tic-tac-toe, right? That's actually pretty easy. You can just look at the board. You've got 9 squares, right? So if X on its first turn has 9 moves, any one of those squares. O on its first turn has 8 moves because 1 move is gone. That's where X put it, right? And so we could actually calculate like how many possible games are there, because we could calculate every position of X and every position of O and then every position of the next X. This is strictly called a permutation, just to be clear. And then we can just run it. It's just like mathematically, it's just a factorial. And then we can get a number, right, which is the possibility space of tic-tac-toe. And that number, by the way, is 362,880. That is the number of possible 9 moves to the end of a game of tic-tac-toe. Now that number is higher, just to be clear, it's an approximation, and it's higher than the number of moves in tic-tac-toe because all I did was just calculate 9 moves by 8 moves by 7 moves. There are some moves you would never do in tic-tac-toe because they would lead to the victory of the other person. So the number is actually smaller than that. My guess would be it'd be about half. But still, about 360,000 moves. And what's interesting is that 360,000 moves, or whatever the reduction is, like say 200,000 moves, is something that children, at a certain age can master, right? Like by the time you're like 13, you can kind of figure it out and then you just know it and then you don't worry about it anymore. So as a game of complexity, it's just not that high, right? It doesn't go that far. This is actually something that we kind of think about with games with kids all the time, just as an aside. Like when you make games for children, you are always thinking at some level about like, how much cognition do they have? Like, what are they capable of doing cognition with? Are they sophisticated enough? There's like a kind of famous thing in game design is to like rag on Chutes and Ladders as not being a game, right? If you've ever played Chutes and Ladders, you like roll a die and you move to a square, or Candyland not being a game because you just like spin a dial and you get a color and then you move to the space of that color. But a designer named Jesse Fuchs made a really strong argument several years ago that Candyland is a game. It's just a game for very young children for whom finding a color on a board and moving a piece to the space of that color is a challenging skill, right? So you can actually start to see how and I like that example a lot because it illustrates something, right? Like for anyone who's older than like 5, Candyland is not an interesting game. But for a 4-year-old, Candyland might be interesting just because the visual challenge of like finding a color on the board. And then, for very young children, the dexterity challenge of like picking a piece up and moving it is enough to make something interesting. And a lot of things that like very, very young children, like babies, do as playful activities, you can actually see it's just like the complexity of like physical movement with hands, right? Just gripping and moving something is challenging enough that can be entertaining for them. So like that kind of complexity is fine. And then we just outgrow it, right? Like we essentially solve it. Now, when you look at that in relation to other games, though, you start to see how this works, right? So if we take a step forward from tic-tac-toe and then we look at a more complex game, like, say, chess, you start to see how combinatorics give us a picture of how things get complicated. Chess, if you start a game of chess, meaning like we set up the board and we have all of our pieces laid out on a board, there are 20 moves you can make from your starting position in chess. I will leave it as a game design challenge to you to figure out what those 20 moves are. But there are 20 moves you can make, and that's it. And because your opponent has a mirrored board, they also can make 20 moves, right? Because they have the same setup that you do. So that means that by move 2 of chess, we have 400 possible board states, right? That's the combinatoric of chess by move 2. What's interesting, though, because that sounds very small, is what happens as you keep going. Now, let's assume, just again, this is not accurate math, but just to get a ballpark, there are 20 moves that happen after your first move. So I make a move, you make a move, and now I get to make a second move. And we'll just assume, for the sake of argument, that I have 20 possible moves. That's not true. I actually have a lot more than 20 moves because if I moved certain pieces, I would have more freedom to move other pieces and it would open up other possibilities. But let's just say it's 20 just to keep the number small, because it's going to get crazy anyway. And you can just do this calculation for yourself. It's 20 times 20 times 20 for the third move of, white moves, 20 moves, black moves times 20 moves, white moves times 20 moves, black moves times 20 moves. By that point, we have 160,000 possible board states, right? Which is almost as much as probably what you had in tic-tac-toe, half of all the possible states of tic-tac-toe. By 6 moves, it's 64 million board states, right? It's an enormous number. There's a really fascinating Radiolab, which is an NPR program about science. And they do like interesting science stories, and they did an episode on games, which is great if you ever have a chance to listen to it. And they talk about chess and like the complexity of chess. And the reality is that if you tried to calculate every possible board state of a chessboard during a game of chess using the rules of chess, it would require all the energy of a single star to hold all the information of all the games of chess that were possible, and then an additional energy of another star to be able to search that database for the game you needed, right? That's how complex chess is. So when you play chess and your head hurts because you're trying to think moves in advance, right? What's happening there is that you are looking at that possibility space and you are trying to calculate your way through that possibility space. And the thing is, like, a human brain can't do that. Like, it's too hard, right? So what happens is you start struggling against it. Like, you just can't see everything. And the better you are at chess, the more you can see of chess, and thus the more you can predict. And so very skilled chess players can beat less skilled chess players simply because they can imagine more board states and they can imagine more actions in the future, and that gives them a capacity to actually solve chess closer to its target. But even there, chess games are unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. And you might be thinking, well, AI has solved it, right? We had, and you might have heard these news stories before that, IBM made AI that beat the best chess players in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But if you study this, it's gotten really interesting because, players actually know that AI exists too, and players start playing with AI and they start learning how AI works, and they use the knowledge that AI has to come up with their own strategies about chess. And so now everybody who plays chess at the highest possible level has played chess with AI and has used AI to build chess games that will beat AI, because it's like AI plus human intelligence, and because this is so complicated that AI can't solve it either, right? And that's what's really fascinating about this. Right now, what's going on in chess tournaments is that players are playing chess using AI to help them learn different board states and learn moves that they had not seen before, and then building that into a catalog in their brain so that when they go into a game, they can respond in real time to that game. And if forced to play against AI with enough study, a chess master can beat an AI by just exploiting what its limitations are. Because again, right, it's more complex than any of us know. And so we're essentially now going to go back and forth with AI for a long time on who's going to be best at chess, because we are going to use our knowledge to supplement each other and just kind of keep building. But it's a marvel of how complex this is. And if you ask yourself, well, why is chess, right? Why has chess has lasted hundreds of years? Chess has lasted thousands of years from its original form, which is an ancient Egyptian game called Senet, where you move pieces around a board. It spread, kind of went through India and then came back. Although it spread into China and Japan and took different forms. There's lots of different variations of chess from its original stuff. But chess, as we understand it in the US and Europe, that chess, right? And in the Middle East, right? That chess has lasted hundreds of years in its form. There have been millions of pages written on chess strategy. And interestingly, we are better chess players today than we were in the past. Chess players, and if you talk to people who play chess, they will affirm this, that experts at chess today would destroy people from 100 years ago, because we are better at chess than they were, which means over 100 years we learned how to play chess better, right? Which tells you something. That's the complexity of it. And that's, to me, that's really interesting. And games can have that kind of complexity, right? They can have a kind of complexity where just the balance is just so, there's just so much of possibility in the game space. There's just so many ways the game can move, and then so many points at which victory can be kind of moved towards or away from, that it's just not possible for you to master and solve the game. And again, just to point this out, chess is not the most complex game we have. Many people think the most complex game we have is Go. Go is played on a 19 by 19 board, and players can place on any square on that board they want. I'm going to provide you with some information about Go in the link below, so you'll get to see it and take a look at it. And like I said, we'll do a little thing with Go just so you'll get your head around it when we start talking about fun. But in 2 moves of Go on a 19 by 19 board, you have 130,000 possible war states. By 3 moves, you are at 46 million possible war states. 3 moves, right? That's enormously complicated. And it's reflected in how people think about Go, right? Like when you play Go, the head exploding thing that happens in chess happens much sooner, and you get this sense that like moves are important, but you just don't know what the right move is, and you know if you screw it up, you've lost the game, but you can't see what it is. What's really interesting to me about that is that like that even exists in chess commentary. I had a really fun experience in my first game design job when I was at Game Lab, where Eric Zimmerman and Frank Lance, Eric was one of the founders of the company and Frank was a head game designer. They decided to just start playing a game of Go. So they had a board set up and they just left it out and they were playing it. Because, it's a 19 by 19 board. This can take days to complete, like if you just played it straight. So like they were just playing it slowly over time. And one day I walked in while Frank was sort of considering the board, and I asked him like, hey, how's the game going? And he's like, oh, I'm winning. And I was like, oh, interesting. Can you explain to me how you're winning? Because I don't know Go very well. And he looked at the board and he said, no, but I know I'm winning. And that is actually the way people talk about Go. They'll talk about moves being auspicious, right? Like meaning like good, like lucky or beneficial, right? They can't actually explain how it works because it's so complicated. You kind of can't even see it. You have to have a feel for the game to play it really well. And it took AI a lot longer to get good at Go. And again, it's still in a loop where humans can work with AI to improve. And like we're still just learning all of these things. So what I want to observe here is that like one way of making games uncertain is just by making them complex, right? Like the more complex the game is, the less likely it is that a human can master it easily. It's the less likely it is that I can master the physical skill, the less likely it is that I can solve it by mastering the possibility space. The more complex the game is, the more it means that like there's space for me in the game to not know what's going to happen. And if I don't know what's going to happen, then my choices are very meaningful because I'm not actually sure what the best choice is, right? In a physical game, is that I'm not sure exactly where to throw or hit the ball such that it will do what I want it to do. Right? It's just like a breakdown in like my skill towards the result I want. But that's not different in a mental game because it's kind of basically the same. Like I need to move a chess piece and I don't know which chess piece is the right piece to move me one step forward in my strategy. And I have to kind of try to figure that out, but I don't know. And that creates uncertainty. Now, this is a really good thing to do with game design, but I want to point out that it has effects on the type of game you're making. And you see this in games that are complex, right? Like games that have a lot of skill in them tend to feel kind of punishing. They tend to reward people who have more skill over people who have less skill, and they tend to not allow people who are less experienced chances to win, right? If you play chess against somebody, and that has an emotional relationship too, I guess, before I jump into my example. Like you feel that as a player too, and that has an effect on the aesthetic, right? Like think about chess again for a second. There's nothing hidden in chess. You can see the entire board. That means that presumably you could predict everything your opponent was going to do because you can see everything they could do, right? The only thing you don't know is what choice they're going to make. And so when you lose a game of chess, it's because you were worse at chess. It's just that simple. There's nothing else you can lean on. You might be worse because you were tired. You might be worse because you were distracted. You might be worse because you suck. Whatever it is, though, you were worse, right? That's not true about all games, right? You can lose a game of poker just because you got bad cards, right? And you could play masterfully and still lose a game of poker. That's not true in Go. Like if you lose a game of Go, it's because you were worse. And while that's an interesting game space and often a fun game space for people, and lots of people like games like that, not everybody likes games like that. And because of that, you may not want to make a game that feels like that. Just like a game that requires like really serious physical skill is often kind of a barrier against people playing. And this is again a feature of a lot of sports, right? Like if you don't know how to play a game like soccer, you're just not actually playing soccer. Right? Like to play soccer well is to have a lot of control over the ball and actually be able to send the ball where you want it to go. And once you get that skill, the whole game changes into a game of teamwork that's like a much more complicated and interesting game. And that's when you actually start playing it, right? Like you're not really playing when you're just like randomly kicking the ball around. But it takes an investment to even get to the point where you can do that. And that also is a hurdle, right? Like, do you want people to have to like learn how to play your game? And if you want digital examples of this, just think about last hitting in MOBAs, right? Like that's an incredibly difficult skill to master, and it has a massive ramification on how you grow through the experience in terms of your power. So like learning that skill is just part of the hurdle of learning those games, and like it's just learning how to like predict the timing and react properly, and it just takes time, and that makes the game less casual, right? Like you have to dedicate more time to it to get good. And so in total, like that's what I want you to think about. Here is one option you have, right? If you create a game that where the skill requirements are high or the possibility space is really big, then what you've done is you've made something that had enough complexity that essentially it's difficult to do. The combinatorics of the system, right? Just the sheer math of like the possibility space of the system can get big enough that it actually becomes uncertain and interesting as a result. And as you can see from the games I'm mentioning, like MOBA, like sports, like chess, like Go, these games can last a very long time because they're puzzles that people can work on for their entire lives. But it's a certain kind of puzzle, a kind of punishing puzzle, a kind of puzzle that's very ranked and your position in it, and a puzzle that doesn't afford the ability for beginners and casual players to really feel like they can play at a higher level. And so complexity and combinatorics is one of the possibilities you have. In the next video, I'm going to start talking about a second possibility to create uncertainty, which is randomness. The one we probably think of the most when we think of games, and in a lot of ways, the one that's the most difficult to work with. And I'm going to introduce how randomness creates uncertainty, what we can and can't do with randomness in games, and how randomness makes very crappy games when we do it badly, but then how randomness can actually make games really uncertain in interesting ways when used properly. I'll see you in the next video.